Why my group is small.
Hmm.
We are going to turn that camera off right there.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Continuing Professional Education Services Hot Topic. Our final hot topic in 2024. Cannot believe that we are rounding up the end of the year and moving into the holidays, as well as into our 2025. So we'll see how things go. Good morning. So we're going to jump right in because we do have a lot to cover. This is about the rule proposal. This is a meeting format, so everybody does have control of their own camera, of their own sound. We would ask that you keep the sound off so that our speakers can be heard. And this is being recorded. It will be shared on our website for the future. I'm Phil Brilliant from Brilliant Environmental Services, as well as Continuing Professional Education Services. Along with me is Dr. George Berkowitz, who is the chairman of the board of CPES. And I'll let him do all the other introductions. Other than the fact I will introduce Julianne Masago, who is our executive director, who I always say, you're in this room because she got you the link and the right information to get you here. We're going to stay on schedule this morning, so I'm not going to talk much longer. And if you have any questions, problems, issues, you want to get the attention of the speaker and you're wildly waving your hand and nobody sees you, put it into the chat. Also put your name in the chat and the company you're with. Just like to see that. Or raise your virtual hand, and I'll make sure to call on you. I'm going to try to keep this in some kind of control and decorum as we go through. We have about 113 people that are planning to be here. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Berkowitz right now, and it's all yours. Good morning, Ray Papperman. Good to see you.
Hey, Ray. Hey, Phil, I'm sorry, I've lost the slides. I can't see if the slides are up or they're not up. Are they up?
I'm going to pull them up. I'm going to pull them up right now.
Okay, thanks. At any rate, good morning, everybody. I was shocked to see the enrollment. We love doing these hot topics. We do them for nothing. We don't get a cent. We may change that as a result of this morning, and make it retroactive to the 113 people that are signed up. I'm sure you'll be glad to pay $100 a person.
Please don't leave.
I'm being facetious. And we do these because we should do them. We do these as an attempt to make sure that the profession that we have embraced, the licensed site remediation profession, and many of you people who are signed up are not licensed site remediation professionals. There are several CEOs, a lot of attorneys, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we do this primarily to nurture the profession of the LSRP. And we do it for nothing because we should do it. And this is a topic that I think is an interest to a lot of people, and a very eclectic group of people, if I might add. And I really want to give the department, I'm good at knocking the department. Having been a former assistant commissioner, I feel it's my right to do that. Having said that, the department took on a yeoman's job of taking policy, procedures, internal procedures, and starting to codify them in an omnibus document. And that's what we have in front of us at this point. Now, this is a proposal. Now, being a former regulator, I will tell you that once a proposal hits the street, it's very unlikely that there are going to be substantive changes or substantial changes. And Rick Engel will tell you, who's always a participant in our hot topics. Hello, Rick, one of my favorite attorneys. He will tell you that once it hits the street in a proposal form, if there are substantial changes in the proposal, they have to repropose. And that starts the whole cycle all over, which is very cumbersome. Promulgating a rule is a daunting procedure. So the department took it on and tried to do some basics. For example, the perfect example, in my opinion, is the section on permits, remedial action permits, which we'll get to. And what they did is that we came up, I was a part of a stakeholder group. We came up with a procedure. The procedure was valid. We spent a lot of time doing it, a lot of meetings, a lot of back and forth. And now it's going to be in a regulation as proposed, if in fact it's accepted. So at any rate, let me go forward. A lot of what we're doing will not be new news to the LSRPs of the world. It's kind of spread all over the landscape of our profession, and we do it routinely. But now stuff that again has been previously procedures or policy are going to be part of a rule. So what does the rule look like? The rule is divided into three major subgroups. Well, that's not true. It impacts three major rules: the SRRA program, the ARCS program, the administrative requirements for remediating contaminated sites program, the technical regulations, and the heating oil. Look at the distribution. SRRA was one page, a quick rule change in the name. ARCS is 78 pages. 60% of the rule proposal is ARCS. Administrative requirements for remediating contaminated sites. That is for the LSRPs and the PRCRs and any other interested party. It's not devoid of responsibilities for LSRPs. All your LSRPs in the world know that. The technical regulations comprise the second most prevalent number, 20%, 26 pages. Heating oil tanks, 2, and miscellaneous stuff. There are 70 amendments proposed in the proposal. 70 amendments. Some of them are very long, others are a paragraph and maybe even a couple of words. There are proposed 4 new rules, which we can talk about later. And basically, it's a proposed to recodify certain existing rules as well. So, next slide, Phil. This is where you're going. This is what we're going to do today. We're going to start off with vapor. I'm not going to read this, but I want to thank our panelists. I am very pleased to introduce you to people who need the introduction. To Steve Sr. from Riker Danzig, and Dennis Toft from CS&G Law. They are a part of our advisory board. They're members of our advisory board. And they are in my opinion, two of the primo environmental attorneys in the state of New Jersey. And we have a great collection of environmental attorneys in the state of New Jersey. And these are certainly two representatives of the creme de la creme, of environmental attorneys. I really appreciate them being with us. We have spent a significant amount of time putting this together, and I hope it works because I planned this for 2 hours, and it looks like Phil's telling me we only have 90 minutes. Good luck. So with that, let's launch into it. I'm going to take the first topic, vapor intrusion. Vapor is probably the most novel or new topic that's been introduced into the regulatory arena. For example, when you're doing an RI now, you have a certain amount of vapor intrusion work that you have to do whether you think there's a vapor problem or not. And that's going to be a significant part of your RI mandates. In addition to that, we have a new item that's called the Indoor Air Notification Area. The Indoor Air Notification Area is a la a CEA, a classification exception area, very similar in terms of scope. But the mandates that accompany the Indoor Air Notification Area is significant. In addition to that, throughout this document, there's a heavy emphasis on public notification, public availability of records. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. But I just want to tell you right now that it's always been a gripe that if in fact a consultant or a PRCR has information that it follows a seminal report and is not needed to be updated for another 2 years, and they don't have to share it with anybody, no, that's no longer the case. And it really gets to the point that, in fact, it goes to the ability for a request for electronic communications to the department or to anybody that you have to be very careful now when you start reading what's required in public notification and what your mandate is in terms of satisfying that request. And it's not just linked to counties and municipalities. It's basically person who can make these requests. And that's always been one of the bugaboos, that we had sampling information that never wound up into the seminal report, and therefore it was not available to the public. Now it's going to be available to the public on a request basis. So this is included in vapor intrusion, particularly in vapor intrusion. So in the notice process, it's available to you as a, okay, let's say you're putting together an REO, and an REO is theoretically a final remediation document. And you want to close it out, but now you have an error issue, you have a vapor issue that's kind of hanging out there. And the department recognizes that there is a sequence of events that will lead to further investigation relative to vapor. And they've actually created a vapor concern area. A vapor concern area is an area that you have soil gas that does not exceed the screening level, but it's there. And maybe nobody knows why it's there. So what you have to do is watch it. This is part of the indoor air notification area process. So what the department has done is created a notice to the RAO that allows you to use that and say, yeah, we want this final remediation document. We have more work to do relative to vapor, but we're going to put this notice in, and this notice will say we have to continue the effort to find the source as well as the impact, and it is very comprehensive. I'm going to list what's involved in real quickly, a indoor air notification area. ID all properties and structures, names, locations, maximum concentration in indoor air, ambient air sampling, soil gas screening levels, indoor remediation levels. Have they been met? Not. What are the latest sampling results? Are the intrusion pathways that you've identified? How have you satisfied the public notification? Have you notified everybody? Has the municipal and county officials notified? Are the health officials notified? Are planning boards notified? So this is a new element. And I don't want to take a lot more time to discuss this, but it is novel. We're going to have to work our way through it. And you also have RAO notices that can say, it's an indeterminate source, as we talked about. It's an indeterminate source is one of the notices that's available, but that means more work, and rightfully so, and rightfully so. The other point, I just want to harken back to what I said, and I don't want you to miss this. VI should be addressed in every RI. So you're going to have to start, if in fact you have volatile, look, you can explain away why you're not looking for it. If your primary contaminant and the only contaminant is PCBs, although PCBs can volatilize, but not much. But having said that, you have the ability to say, there's an indeterminate source, we're doing more investigation, and we will get involved perhaps in long-term monitoring to see if there's a diminishing values that are associated with vapor concern areas. Again, a vapor concern is soil gas that does not exceed the soil screening level, but it's there. And the question is, why is it there? And can it get worse, or will it diminish? I'm going to stop there, and I'll turn it over to Steve Sr., who's going to talk about all appropriate inquiry.
George, before you move on, I think Steve and I probably might want to add a little bit to each of these topics.
Yep.
The one thing that George pointed out, first of all, is VI should be evaluated early on, but from a lawyer's perspective, this is going to create further impetus for folks to look to hire plaintiffs' attorneys and pursue claims against parties performing remediation, both because of the notices that have to go out and because the issue is going to be more widespread and more known. So it's something, as you think about performing remediation, you almost need to start looking at public relations type issues, how you deal with folks that are within a vapor area. Do you want to be upfront about it and be aggressive to try to head off these types of claims? The other thing it's going to impact is the PLL insurance underwriting market, because now there are going to be more exclusions in all likelihood for vapor intrusion type claims. These, and it's always the boogeyman, right? The plaintiff's lawyer is always the boogeyman, but we're seeing things now where they're even taking CEAs and using them to file class actions representing everybody within the plume. And that's happening now in Gloucester County. You can see it happening more and more depending upon what happens with that case. So it's fraught with risk, as one would say.
So,
Steve,
yeah, I'll jump in for a second. And by the way, I don't know if everybody saw, I love the question that just flashed up in the chat. Who owns the air, right? Just like for years and years, we've talked about, well, who owns the groundwater and how does that relate to CEAs? And I think that's a fine question and one of the things I want to comment on.
It's not who owns the air, who owns the contaminant.
Or who owns the space that the air is in. I mean, what I think I agree with George, and I always think about whether or not to say something like that. Dennis and I have participated in many programs with George, and many of you who are out there in the audience have done that as well. But I do agree with George on the point that vapor intrusion is one of the more significant changes to this rule. There's a lot of pages devoted to it. There are new requirements. There is a lot of it that's just kind of codifying what has been going on, what is happening. Vapor intrusion has operated a little bit sort of through guidance and almost in the background. And so a lot of the changes, I think, just kind of codify and elevate into the rules things that we have been doing with respect to vapor intrusion. And I think that's good and important. The idea of an indoor air notification area gives me some pause. It's, in effect, it's like a CEA for groundwater. And, one of the reasons why I love that question. But I do wonder, and I agree with Dennis that, the types of notifications that now we'll be talking about with respect to vapor intrusion, it's going to, bring more notice, more issues, potentially more claims, from affected persons. But I'm still not quite clear on how this indoor air notification area is going to operate, especially when you think about how vapor intrusion gets investigated, especially in areas where there's residential property. You have a sample at one property, the neighbor you don't, you have another sample at the next one, the one behind, the one in front. How is the area going to be defined? Is it going to be broad? Is it going to be based upon pinpoint data? And to me, that's a little bit confusing and kind of potentially fraught with some issues. So I agree. This is an area where we're going to see, more activity. We're going to need to bring more attention to it, and one that occupies a lot in this rule proposal and warrants your attention.
Good comments.
And in particular, if you're doing a remediation in an environmental justice community, this could become an even more significant issue.
All good points.
Agreed.
And I have a lot to say about that, but I'm not going to say any of it. Let's move on. Steve?
Okay, well, I have a feeling it's going to come out later, George, but we'll leave it to that. And since this is, I'm going to talk about all appropriate inquiry and really discharge reporting. All of this is about discharge reporting, something we've talked about, complained about, wrung our hands over for many, many years, and especially since the LSRP program was adopted. But I just take this opportunity to thank George, to thank Phil, to thank Jules for bringing the program together, for you folks for agreeing to wake up early on a dreary, I don't even know what day it is, Wednesday morning, I think. And I'll apologize for the lingering head cold, which I think I'm on the mend at this point. But, you know, we all agreed, you know, Dennis and George and I kind of picked out, I think, I don't know, 10 or 11, 12, whatever number of topics we have here, that these were important to bring to people's attention. And one of them was, you know, what the department has done with respect to all appropriate inquiry and discharge reporting. And, you know, this is a pretty sophisticated crowd here today. Many of you are aware that the fact that LSRPs have had a discharge reporting obligation has given rise to changes with respect to how all appropriate inquiry was conducted in the past, and especially in real estate deals. It gave rise to the exclusion of LSRPs from due diligence in order that parties would, you know, frankly, avoid a discharge reporting obligation if or at least not create a new obligation to commence a remediation immediately if discharges were discovered during, let's say, pre-purchase due diligence. You know, a lot of parties want to be able to manage the process of how those items are addressed in a transaction. And so this has been debated, you know, long and hard over many years, and it was debated during what we call SRRA 2.0, the amendments that give rise to these rules. And you really, to sort of jump to the end, you know, what is a little bit of a bombshell is that the department added into this rule the idea that any person, a person who has knowledge or knows of a discharge of a hazardous substance, has a reporting obligation to the department. So that's separate even from the idea of all appropriate inquiry, but it raises the question of, well, you know, who has this reporting obligation? You know, does a lawyer who has knowledge of a discharge have a reporting obligation? Does a person walking down the street who knows, you know, nothing about site remediations, not involved in the process? It's a very broad provision that would establish this obligation, that any person who becomes aware of a discharge has an obligation to report it. And I'll note it's pretty interesting that in supporting or providing the authority for this rule, the department cites sort of its broadest authorities and even enabling legislation, because there's no specific place in a statute that the department can talk about the authority for this broad of a discharge reporting provision. So if you're interested in those citations, they're in the rule proposal. Be happy to provide them, but you can look at them and see that other than a person who is responsible for the discharge of the hazardous substances, you know, that obligation doesn't appear anywhere in the law. Another thing that is wrapped up in this is the idea now that all appropriate inquiry is considered remediation that is subject to the department's rules. And there are certain exceptions for, you know, when one might have to hire an LSRP in order to do all appropriate inquiry or other types of things. But by virtue of SRRA 2.0 amendments, all appropriate, or the definition of remediation under, let's say, the tech regs and ARCs now arguably covers activities that are all appropriate inquiry. And certainly the department has clarified its intent in the preamble to the rule, that if you're performing all appropriate inquiry, that is remediation, you know, subject to the department's type of requirements. Since I just mentioned it, I will commend, and I thought George was going to say this, maybe he did and I didn't hear it, but when there's a rule proposal like this, it's very frequently worth reading the preamble to the rule, because you know, the department lets you know what they're trying to accomplish. Some of it's frankly self-serving, but it's useful. I could tell you lawyers look at it, years later when we try to interpret what the rule was intended to mean. So there's usually lots of little sort of nuggets for policy wonks and people who really want to interpret rules in that information, and also in the response to comments that will come. So I commend that to you, but I've digressed a little bit. The last thing I just wanted to say about this was there is a clarification in the rule of the department's intent that a person who conducts all appropriate inquiry who discovers a discharge does not become responsible for that discharge unless and until they purchase the site, they own the site. Now, it doesn't discuss, for example, the innocent purchaser defense or any of the other defenses that we have in our law, for example, if someone else is remediating that discharge. But, you know, nonetheless, that is there, and I think that this defense is still available. So I'll pause there. I don't know, Dennis, if you want to jump in, George, you want to jump in, take it in a different direction, go.
But Steve, can I just jump in real quick? And I think
Sure.
it's interesting, and that they now tie this into remediation. And I remember these conversations in that room with Senator Smith, and we can all talk about the nuclear approach and everything that what came out of it. And Peterson saying, "I'll handle it in regulations," yada yada, the whole entire thing. But the interesting part that I don't believe is addressed, unless I missed it, is if an LSRP is now required and there's retention requirements, this now creates a whole new world in the department's online system of how LSRPs retain for people who are not necessarily the original PRCR because they're buying a property, it's all appropriate inquiries. It creates what I think is going to be a world that they cannot handle. And I don't see that addressed at all.
Well, it kind of is, Phil, because they kind of talk out of two sides of their mouth a little bit, because it does say an LSRP does not have to be retained to do due diligence.
Right.
And they quote
Right.
the provisions of SRRA 2.0 to say an LSRP is not required if the investigation is not legally required, conducted to obtain an REO, or conducted to investigate, clean up, or respond to known, suspected, or threatened discharges of contaminants. So you don't have to hire an LSRP to do due diligence.
Right.
But the interesting thing is the language they quote or refer to in SRRA 2.0, and it's on page 7 of the preamble, is exactly the language we all debated on this point before SRRA 2.0 was adopted. And there was a lot of time and a lot of effort spent. There were folks from the department pushing this issue at the time of the legislation. We went back and forth about the definition of remediation and remediate, because I think it is clear that when you get to the point of remediation, it has to be done under the auspices of an LSRP. But the whole point was due diligence won't work if this reporting obligation exists. And that's why the language referenced on page 7 of the preamble was included in SRRA 2.0 to specifically provide that transactions can happen, that due diligence can happen outside the realm of LSRPs, primarily to avoid creating a scenario where a reporting obligation is triggered, usually in the case of a seller who doesn't has no reason to know of a discharge, but doesn't want, by entering into a transaction, to trigger an obligation that then leads to a cleanup in a transaction where the buyer then walks away. And
Sorry, Dennis, go ahead.
the department seems to have forgotten all that, and has turned everything on its head again in this rule proposal. And I'll add a couple of other glosses to what Steve said. Think about all of the old phase 1s and PAs consultants may have in their files going back over the years for deals that never happened. Do you have to dig those up and call a hotline now if this rule's adopted? There are all kinds of nuances that were not completely thought through when this was adopted, because if all of a sudden everybody starts calling the hotline and reporting discharges, that's when the department gets overwhelmed. They can't handle the discharge notifications they have now. When you look at folks like who call in off-site sources, they go into a black hole. And if this happens, they're going to be completely overwhelmed at a time when they're going to be subject to a hiring freeze. So this is very problematic proposal in many respects, both for the regulated community, for PRCRs, and ultimately for the department.
All good stuff.
So George, I know you probably want to jump in, but
I
I
do
want
want
to
to jump in.
say
Go ahead.
two things first, because I mean, Dennis said it, I meant to say it, but I want to repeat it. I mean, I think it's fair to say that on the point of this, any person who has knowledge of a discharge must report it. That point was considered in the discussion of SRA 2.0, and it was rejected.
Right.
And so, you know, the idea that the department has proposed it in a rule, I think is really counter to what the discussion was during the 2.0 amendments. And I think, you know, Dennis started to identify what the implications of this will be. And I think there are many, include how are parties going to organize themselves around doing due diligence, whether it's with LSRPs or not, whether it's pre-transactional, post-closing transactional, prohibitions on sampling. There are going to be a lot of implications, I think, that, you know, some we can begin to see, and probably others, you know, we all like to joke about unintended consequences because it was a former assistant commissioner's favorite phrase. In any event, sorry, George.
No, all good stuff. I want to get back to the information that needs to be gleaned relative to specific knowledge of a discharge. What does that mean?
Good question.
Aunt Martha, I've divided in two categories: technical information and empirical information. And by empirical information, Aunt Martha's driving down on Route 22 and a gas tanker overturns, and she sees a discharge, what appears to be gasoline, into a stream. Is that specific knowledge that deserves to be reported? And the answer could be yes. All right. However, when it comes to technical knowledge, what do you do if you want to know that that sheen that you're seeing on the swamp water is not petroleum, but it's a flock of iron oxide? Technical information will tell you the difference. And when you get technical information, my point is, and a word to the wise, no information is valid until it's been quality assured. Don't fall into the trap of dealing with preliminary information and reporting it. That can get you into big trouble.
Well, you
Well,
know, go ahead,
go ahead,
Dennis.
Steve.
Sorry.
Now go ahead.
I was just going to say, you know, we could spend the next, you know, hour or whatever time Phil will allocate to us today to talk about this topic. I don't want to, you know, cut off the conversation. So Dennis, if you were going to continue, please do. But, you know, maybe we would move on to the next one.
So I just wanted to point out that when I was in law school, we always talked about Aunt Susie, not Aunt Margaret. But
thank you for pointing that out, Dennis.
Yeah, but I do think that your point, George's point, is valid. Is who has knowledge?
Yeah.
You know, every time you fill up your tank and the attendant drips a few drops on the ground, does that mean you're calling the hotline?
Filling up your lawnmower.
Exactly. Well, what about the PAHs on the side of my driveway? I if we have some DEP folks here, you know, I'm joking, obviously.
I know, Steve. I know, Steve. I may have to call the hotline on you.
There you go.
Yeah.
Let's move on.
Let's jump on to the next topic.
Yep.
We'll be back to that, I'm sure.
No, we won't.
Well, certainly, if the people have questions or want to discuss it, we can come back. But I have the next topic, talking about the provisions or the proposed provisions dealing with threatened and endangered species. The interesting thing is DEP's view is that this is something people should have been doing all along, because in order to issue an RAO, an LSRP has to say the site is in compliance and the remediation is in compliance. And if remediation somehow is inconsistent with the endangered and non-game species laws, it can't be in compliance. So what they've added is specific language saying that when you're performing a remediation, you have to address the location and timing of activities to protect any adverse impacts or avoid adverse impacts to wildlife. This raises a number of concerns, not the least of which is it applies not only to the site where the remediation is being performed, but also to any adjacent sites. So for instance, if you're cleaning up a site on a river, your site might not be habitat, but the river clearly is going to be. Does it affect your timing as to when activities can be performed on the upland? It creates a whole new realm of knowledge base that LSRPs need to either get or have someone available to them to address this potential impact. You know, it's easy to start by looking at the DEP's landscape project maps to see if a site or adjacent sites are mapped as potential habitat. But then what do you do with the information if you're an LSRP? Do you, as an LSRP, have the technical knowledge to know whether you're having an impact on that species or that species habitat? So it creates this whole new realm of activity to apply to both PRCRs and LSRPs. It certainly, from a due diligence standpoint, just like we're talking about, makes it more important that people looking at doing brownfield deals evaluate whether the site and any adjacent areas are potential habitat, and then consider how the remedial design is going to work. Now, having said all that, the law has always required people to comply with all environmental regulatory requirements. So the department's not necessarily wrong about that, but by calling it out this specifically, they're certainly adding steps that the regulated community and the LSRPs will need to follow in looking at sites and looking at areas adjacent to sites that are being remediated.
Mm.
So it's another can of worms that's been opened more specifically here. And frankly, according to the department, it's something we should all be doing now.
Mm-hmm.
And because often you're dealing with timing restrictions on work in or affecting endangered species habitat, is that now a justification for getting an extension of a deadline because you can't do work during certain parts of the year? All some things that are now going to have to be taken into account. So all you LSRPs, you should either be finding folks who are wildlife experts, either in your shops or elsewhere, or starting to learn this area of the environmental world.
Mm-hmm. Dennis, I have a question. Are there certification for professionals like that, or is it just based on experience and education?
There are certain certifications, they're not at the level of an LSRP certification, but certain people in this field are experts with respect to certain things. And, you know, some people, for instance, are bat experts, and some people are bald eagle experts. And they're recognized for that. That's what they've studied. And there are people who are more generalists, but the good consultants in this area will say, you know, I don't know this species as well as my colleague. Let's bring my colleague in.
Mm-hmm. Good. Thank you.
I think for me, a question that, you know, will get created is, you know, at what sites do we really need to think about these kinds of things? I think, as you said, Dennis, the department would say we should be addressing this already. And I think there are sites where where it's been obvious, you know, you're out somewhere in, you know, Hunterdon or Warren or Sussex County, and, you know, there are obvious environmental receptors that, you know, need to be considered. But I do wonder if, you know, this will affect a broader range of sites now, whether just because there's new attention to it, or if, you know, there are other sites where, you know, threatened and endangered species have been a little bit kind of under the radar, and, you know, these new requirements will require it to be considered in a way that it hasn't in the past.
I think it will affect sites that where it hasn't been considered. I'll give you an example. There's an eagle nest up on the Palisades, and the eagle's foraging range includes a lot of contaminated sites along the Hudson River. There are timing restrictions as to when works can be done on those properties. So that's the type of thing where the habitat's adjacent to a site or within the foraging range of the eagle, where the timing of the remediation could be impacted. And of course, time affects money. So there are those types of things that aren't necessarily intuitive when you're focused on cleaning up a site. Bill Linder's talking about mussels in the Arthur Kill. Absolutely, you know. But what it does, at least initially, is it will require us in the field to look at the landscape project maps and say, okay, what's mapped in this area that I might need to be concerned about? And it's something that should be done up front, because depending upon techniques you use, it could impact your RI phase as well.
I mean, I think some of this is reflection of, positive outcomes, improvements in wildlife protection and habitat, right? Eagles, peregrine falcons, ospreys, all are doing well and improving. I see every once in a while peregrine falcons around my office tower here in Morristown. I have a case now where something called the change map, it was relatively new to me, connecting habitats across New Jersey.
I-95.
Hey, Roger, how you doing?
Roger, get there safely.
There you go, please. The change map connecting habitats across New Jersey, starting to see it in some of in some of our cases, like the landscape map. So, this issue and frankly, as species populations expand and improve, that have historically been under duress, we may see it more and more. The bobcats range, for example, expanding. Bears obviously expanding.
Okay, are we done with this, or shall we move on?
I think so.
Done,
Okay.
done for now. Jump in,
All right.
George.
Okay, so I wanted to just comment real quickly about the advice to take a look at the narrative. The narrative is 80 pages of the 219 pages. And the narrative is a really good, as Dennis has pointed out, a really good examination of what the department was thinking about, what they want you to do. And it means that you don't have to have those 4 copies of the various regulations in front of you, that none of it is in the annotation because it hasn't been annotated yet. And you say, see, no changes here, no changes from section 125. No, the narrative gives you all that stuff. So I highly recommend it. Let me get into something that is important, and that simply is the remedial action permit. The first thing I want to bring to your attention is vapor intrusion now requires, anytime there's a control for vapor intrusion requires a remedial action permit. I didn't want to overlook that. Basically, anytime you have a non-unrestricted site with a deed notice, with an engineering control, with monitor natural attenuation, the indoor air remediation system, all that requires a remedial action permit. Now, a bunch of us got together and were very concerned with the, what's the word, the randomness of how the department was issuing notices of incompleteness or requests to withdraw your remedial action permit application. We basically took on the department in terms of their expertise and their familiarity with the pertinent technical aspects of a remedial action permit. Gwen Zervis was in charge at that time. She was new to the job. She saw that there were problems because so many permits were being rejected or sent back, incomplete, such as incomplete or please withdraw. So she put together, and I was whispering in her ear for quite a while about this, and she put together a stakeholder group. And the stakeholder group said you cannot treat all RAP applications the same. You can't lump them into the one bag and pick one out and let's see how that one's going to fly. What you need to do is surgically speciate, if you will, the various permit applications based on type and complexity, and assign the right people to those types of permits. And that's what they did. That's what they did. And that demonstrates the 5 types. Aside from all the other stuff that we have with the complex sites and all that, what we try to do is take care of the low-hanging fruit and move them through the system expeditiously. And that basically all 5 of those fit into that category, or almost all 5 fit into that category. You'll get a lot more complex remedial action permits guaranteed that are not going to fit into these categories and are not going to be available to you when you apply. But let's go through the real quickly. Let's go through the 5 types, and they're pretty simplistic. First of all, type 1, no engineering control. Soils and upland sediments are less than non-restricted standards, but above the unrestricted use. And the impacted groundwater is not an impact. Type 2, the remedy is a presumptive remedy for soils for schools, childcare, or residents, but the presumptive remedy is not required. You're just going to use it. It makes an easy decision for the department. Type 3, the permittees are implementing an alternate remediation process which is approved by the department. You got a letter in your hand, you propose the alternative remediation, DEP approves it, you go with type 3. Type 4, historic fills present at the site. The PASI performed on the entire site, and all other areas have either been remediated or are being remediated. And other RAOs have been issued at that site. And finally, type 5 is when you have a monitoring natural attenuation approved for groundwater, and the CEA is for only the site. Any on-site receptors are not impacted. That's type 5. So what we have here is an effort to tease through those permits that are not complex, and then therefore the appropriate people doing the review can bear on the permit applications that's suited to their expertise and experience. Kudos to Gwen. She did a great job in this. And that's it for me on the RAPs.
I'll maybe say a couple of words about it, and I agree. Kudos the changes that have been made in this regard. They're good. They're positive. I just can't resist saying to me that they're also kind of incremental. I think that George is right. If we can take like these classes of permits out of kind of the general permit review pool, that'll be helpful. Maybe we can improve timeframes and responses on permit applications. So, all to the good. I have long hoped for a more kind of robust change to the permitting program that was initially set up, because I think that the Site Remediation Reform Act allows it. But I'll just end on the positive note that these I think are good and useful changes to the permit program.
Right. My motivation was different. I got involved with this only because of the quality of comments we were getting back from the reviewers, which was a red signal to me that a lot of the reviewers were over their head. And in terms of technical expertise and acumen and experience. And that was the primary purpose of trying to do all this. Sure, we had a backlog. The backlog resulted from a lot of the inexperience that a lot of the reviewers had. And we haven't solved that. We have not solved that problem. But on the other hand, it's an attempt to solve it. And again, I think Gwen realized that right from the get-go, that a lot of these rejections, a lot of these incompletes were just to get it off their desk and get it back into the hands of the people submitting it. So, and that became a cyclical event, and therefore you had these recurrence of the same permit every time. So that was my motivation for doing this, and I think it was a lot of the motivate for the other stakeholders as well.
Just to add two other things, and you may have mentioned this, George, but going forward, you're going to have one remedial action permit per site,
Yep.
which should make life easier in terms of biennial certifications. You don't have to track multiple permits. And I think we talked about it in the VI section, but there's going to be a VI wrap now too.
Yes, I said that. Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a question that just came in, but also just a comment back. They talk about the timeframes. From my review, there's nothing in here similar to what they have in land use, which puts any time constraints on whether the department's review or the applicant's turnaround time. It's still an open end. There's nothing in there like that at all.
Yeah, we didn't even broach that subject. I tell you that because we knew exactly what the response was going to be.
Back to you, Steve.
Okay. I'm going to talk about public notifications and summary reports a bit. And I'm going to invite George to comment because I know this is a topic that he is interested in. And we might disagree a little bit about the significance of it, but we have fun when we do that. So there was discussion of this during, SRRA 2.0 and those amendments. There was discussion of providing more information, earlier notification of, the work that's being performed of contaminated sites to municipalities and the public. There had been some concern expressed as to whether and when remediating parties and LSRPs had been responding to inquiries by the public about contaminated sites. And, as George noted earlier, because of the way remediation was occurring under the LSRP program without a case manager at DEP who knew something about the site, information could sit in an LSRP's or a remediating party's files for years before, let's say a key submittal report was required to be submitted without anyone really having information about data that had been generated or the site itself. And so there were kind of a basket of concerns and issues that have been identified around the availability of information on remediation of contaminated sites and how the LSRP program had affected that. And so there were some changes in 2.0 and put into the rules. And so, for example, some of the notifications that had been required and the notification that had been required at the remedial action phase of a project was moved earlier into the process to the remedial investigation phase when municipalities need to have a notice of the activity. There's kind of an expanded universe of documents and information that municipalities can request of remediating parties. And so that was added and addressed. A clear obligation that the person responsible for conducting remediation must respond to inquiries by the public, either with specific information or documents that responds to the request. And so, sort of a thoughtful request by a member of the public could mean that specific data, specific reports need to be provided in response to that request. Or as an alternative, a summary report could be developed about the site on a form. I think it's still to be determined by the department. I haven't seen this form, but there's some specific information, and a responsible party or a person conducting remediation could provide that information in response to a public inquiry. And then kind of lastly, I think that this was clear, but putting into the rule that a remediating party could designate their LSRP as someone who would respond to these requests. In terms of the summary report itself, I'll just give you, some of the specifics. The report is and this is the summary report that a remediating party would provide in response to an inquiry from the public. I mean, frankly, it makes me think about some of the fact sheets that we have already developed, but it might be more significant than that. We haven't seen the form. A description of the historical industrial activity that gave rise to the contamination. What is the contamination? The sources of it, the extent of it, the current remedial status of the project, proposed remedial actions, including the schedule for those activities, actions to minimize the impact to the public, interim remedial measures, for example. There might be other kinds of things, and a list of online resources about the contamination that's at the site. And this is kind of specified in the rule or the rule proposal as to what ought to be included in this summary report. There are some additional, and I think primarily because of the attention to vapor intrusion and immediate environmental concerns in the rule proposal, there's some additional reporting, I think, that's created in connection with those items as well. So I do think that there's an emphasis on more public notification. There's certainly some specifics as to, what will be required. But I sort of wonder, what the impact of this will be ultimately. I know that historically there were concerns when, the department set forth requirements to give off-site notifications and fact sheets and, creating sort of the need to provide these notifications and opportunity for, the affected public, let's say, to learn about contaminated sites. I would just say in my own experience, that hasn't really in the past materialized into, in my view, greater awareness or much more attention by the public to contaminated sites, even in their neighborhood. So I'm not certain that this new emphasis or attention on these items will change any of that. But I think that remains to be seen. There are more details and more requirements for public notification. And I think I'll kind of reserve judgment on whether it's particularly impactful until we see how it plays out. But I'll pause there.
Yeah, Steve, if I just jump in real quickly, I see these summary reports as not being one report, but it being a cycle of reports. Every time you have new information, the report may have to be updated every time and there's a new threat to a different area of residences or schools or so forth. You have to update. But what I find daunting is that persons have the right to ask responsible parties for communications, written or electronic, with DEP, between the person responsible for cleanups and those communication with DEP. Apparently, they're empowered to ask for those communications, which is very interesting. So, and this is part and parcel of the tearing back the sheets that protect PRCRs from sharing information. This is a greater emphasis in the ability for the public to be aware of what's going on. And it's tough to argue with that, but the impacts of that could be profound.
Okay, if nothing else, why don't we flip over to Dennis?
Okay, this will be relatively quick. The SRRA 2.0 adjusted some things with respect to remediation funding sources and financial assurances, and the rules are proposed or reflecting that now, 5 years later, including allowing the use of surety bonds, updating the language for environmental insurance policies, but perhaps most significantly, just recognizing now in the rules that for a party who is under direct oversight, adjusted direct oversight, you can use financial mechanisms other than a remediation trust fund. And that's specifically set out in the statute, and now it's going to be incorporated into the rules. I think those involved in the bonding industry and in the insurance industry will want to focus on some of the language requirements in the surety bonds and the environmental insurance policies, just to make sure it's consistent. There are limits on renewal timeframes and notices of non-renewal for those mechanisms. But those are the types of things that are really implementing what the statute provided. So I think it's beneficial to have it. Some of these things are being used already without it being in the rules. And it's just good that they're now incorporating them into ARCs so that it's clear.
Okay.
Hey, George, can I jump back? I see there's a couple of questions about the public notification issue in the chat. I think
Sure.
they can be answered quickly. One question is, about the DEP communications you raised, couldn't they be obtained from DEP because they're public record? I mean, I think the answer is probably yes, although that would
That's
be
a burden.
yeah, through Oprah.
Yep.
And, that's not an easy process to navigate. And so frankly, I think DEP would want, remediating parties to provide them, because it's easier for the agency and just easier. And the question about whether the CID, I think, serves as the summary report. I don't think that DEP intends that the CID could be that because of its nature. I mean, we've all read CIDs. I mean, talk about mind-numbing and difficult. But I think a CID doesn't necessarily have all the information that's required in the summary report.
Right.
Because of that notes box, you have some flexibility as to what you could put in there. So presumably you could include that additional information. Remains to be seen. I don't know what DEP will do in terms of its form, and whether the CID actually will cover it. So.
Yeah. I just want to promote the use of a CID in other areas. And every time I get a new project, the first thing I look at is the CID. And there's all kinds of quality of CIDs that you have to examine. But it is in my opinion, it is a really good document to start understanding what's going on at a site.
I think you're up, George.
Okay.
George, you're up. Your alternative fill.
All right. This is I haven't been given it to you. This is part of the technical regulation section. This one is page 212, the alternative fill use plans. This is kind of simplistic, but basically what we're saying is that anytime you're using fill as a remediation, that's FILL, using this isn't a commercial for fill, PHIL, but anytime you're using fill as a remediation, you need a fill reuse plan. Even if it's clean, and more importantly, even if it's not clean, and a fill can come from the same site, or it can come from another site that has to be evaluated in terms of the material. What's good about using on-site, you probably have a lot of good information about what's there. It's been investigated. Off-site's a completely different beast. And I have personal experience with games that get played with doing off-site contamination. One of my jobs was to approve clean fill coming from Staten Island. And that's oxymoronic. And I got fired from the job, to be perfectly honest with you. Thank God. I told my wife I wanted to quit anyway. But having said that, accepting fill is a very interesting process. Now, everybody would think like on like. It doesn't stop with like on like. It begins with like on like. In other words, you're not supposed to introduce additional contaminants. You're not supposed to go through over the 75th percentile of the contaminants that's already there. Your materials should be less than what's there already, quite frankly. So that's what everybody thinks is the rule. The important point simply is that there is a provision for you to put dirty on clean. Let me say that again. There is a provision for you to put dirty soil on top of unrestricted clean soil. And the quid pro quo there simply is that in the process, let's identify the two different sites. One is the donor site where you're taking the material from, and one is the receiving site where you're taking it to. The donor site is dirty, the receiving site's clean. And you have a situation where doing a development and you want to put, let's say, fee simple houses on the dirty area, but you have a clean area that you're going to put multiple story residences or so forth and so on. So you want to say, well, okay, let's put the fee simple houses on the clean area. No, it's not as attractive, and the viewscapes, et cetera, et cetera. So now the question is, how do I get clean areas that I can use the fill and place it on the site in order to reduce costs and logistics? Can I do that? And the answer is you can. And here's how you do it. If on the donor site, you are now going to create 25% of the area of that site that is now going to be unrestricted, you can now take that soil that is causing it to be restricted and move it over to the unrestricted area, and DEP will allow that under certain circumstances. Now, let's say, well, you're creating a new area of concern and so forth, but the regulations allow it. And it took me, it only took me about 2 meetings with DEP to convince them to do that. And thank God for Barry Frasco, because he understood the regulation. But you can do it. And it still exists as a possibility. Clearly, the intent is really not to create other areas of concern, and I get that. But in the name of redevelopment, in the name of logistical issues, the DEP has allowed for you to understand that you, in the process of moving soil from a donor site, and you're creating an unrestricted area, that's 25% of the site, you can do it. So, generally speaking, fill is an interesting subject. You have to be very careful, extremely careful of what you're accepting. Don't allow any shortcuts. Know who's doing the sampling. Know who's doing the reporting. Who's witnessing the sampling. You know, that's a big one. You know, you get these reports, and Joe Schmo was out there, and he's a certified professional engineer, and he witnessed the sample, so forth and so on. What's his credentials? What's his experience? What risk is he taking to his professional license, if he has one, in doing this? So pretty much that particular issue generally flies under the radar, that you can put dirty on clean as long as you're creating an unrestricted area that is 25% of the donor site. Okay, that's it.
So
I
a question did pop up, and I think you may have just answered at the end there, but does the new contaminated area have to be smaller in area than it was at the donor site?
No, there's no specification. There's no specification whatsoever as to how that happens. But you know, that's a good question, because basically you are creating a new area of concern. There's no doubt about that. But you got to deal with it depthly. You've got to really be able to argue why it's important to the project, why it's got to be done, that the contamination will be with an engineering control, that you're committed to doing that, and so forth and so on.
Sorry, Dennis, I cut you off.
Just a couple of other thoughts real quick. One is the extent to which you can reuse a contaminated fill and whether you can go higher than the existing grade. going to
Oh,
become.
yeah, good point. No, you know what the answer is. Tell them what the answer is, Dennis.
Well, the answer is no.
Right.
The whole world of alternative fill, I think, still needs some careful thought to it,
Yeah.
particularly because of new flood hazard requirements, where there's going to be a need to elevate sites, including contaminated sites. And there's not a lot of fill out there that doesn't have some issue with it.
Yeah.
The other gloss I'll add to it is if you are bringing in alternative fill from off-site, you probably should make sure that the person bringing it to you is appropriately licensed under the dirty dirt law.
Yeah, 901. Right. Right. All good points. Yeah, Dennis, you raise a really good point about raising elevations of flood-prone areas. That's going to create an incredible demand for fill. And it ain't going to be clean. I guarantee you it's not going to be clean. There's no way, in my opinion, unless you start digging up Sussex County and bringing it down to Hudson County.
Or unless it's processed somehow and made clean.
I guess. I'm not convinced that there are a lot of effective processes out there, but if when you do it, it tends to be very expensive and raises the cost of fill beyond maybe what's practical.
So I'll just make sort of one comment, and I think George already did, and then we can move on to the next topic maybe. The confluence of these alternative fill requirements, the new flood hazard or the flood hazard area proposal, the various rules, frankly, real and addressing climate change or adaptation, and the A901 rules, the soil recycling rules that Dennis was just referring to, all those things coming together, I think means if you are addressing fill at a contaminated site, you need to be really careful.
Yeah.
Because there are a lot of details, there are a lot of sort of tricks and traps, and probably a lot of attention that will be paid to the issue, after you're done. So be really careful.
The other point is if it doesn't look, as you LSRPs are probably going to be placed in the crosshairs when for approving the importation of clean fill to a site that you're responsible for. If it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. And you can't minimize your involvement. You cannot minimize your involvement. Do I want to take a trip out to Staten Island every time that there's a load of clean fill, quote unquote clean fill coming in? No, but I should. Not necessarily every time, but at least a representative of me. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, since I was listening to myself, I said be really careful. I didn't mean don't do it. I mean do it properly.
Yeah.
Because, I know some of those projects that George is talking about where they moved fill and they used it creatively to, improve the cleanup and redevelopment. And that was really great service to the clients.
Yeah.
And that's really where you want to be. You want to be providing great service. And so when I say be careful, I don't mean don't do it. I mean, do it properly, do it smartly, and do it. So annulment of RAOs. Go ahead.
Well, Steve, before we jump on and go over there, there was a question. If George, just go over real quick. You mentioned 25% of the site. Can you go over that real quick?
The donor site, 25% of the donor site has to be remediated to be clean.
Question about that. Okay, good. Now, again, my favorite part of this whole rule proposal, prepared probably by a divorce attorney, getting involved. So we're gonna have Steve deal with annulments.
Bill, you have experience.
I have a lot of experience with this, and I wish I would have known a little bit more about this as an LSRP. That annulments can be involved. So it's up to you, Steve.
Can we take that offline? So, this is not that exciting of a topic, except for the word. I don't know, couldn't you come up with like a different word than annulment? The department has, proposed a rule that would allow it to annul RAOs in situations where the LSRP who issued it can't let's say change the RAO, withdraw it or change it, where the LSRPs become incapacitated, died, has not renewed his or her license. Those are the sort of specifics that set out in the rule proposal. You know, one of the ways that this has come up in the past is when there have been some LSRPs who have retired. And, you know, after they've retired, you know, there are different reasons why they might not want to touch an RAO they issued when they weren't retired. And frankly, I'm not sure that this proposal completely fixes that problem, because you might have an LSRP who still has a license that's valid, and he or her is retired. But nonetheless, they're trying to address this place where an LSRP can't change an RAO that the department needs to be changed, or the department thinks needs to be changed. And they would distinguish this from a situation where the department thinks an RAO needs to be changed, maybe because they think it's not protective, and the LSRP won't change it. That's a different situation. You know, in that situation, the department could and might invalidate the RAO, but that's different than the situation where they would call it an annulment. It's probably, its application may be limited, this proposal, but it has arisen in the past, and it probably will arise again in the future.
Not as exciting as I thought it would be.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry.
Well,
but-
look, I think department chose the word annulment deliberately because they're much like the Vatican, and as I recall, only the Pope and the Vatican can grant annulments.
What if you're Jewish?
I don't know that process, George. I'll leave
Okay,
that to you.
I'll look into it.
I'll explain that to you later, George. If you want to, unless you want to jump in on that one, Dennis, you can jump on the timeframes.
Yeah, I mean, this is nothing new. This has been the policy for a long time, that timeframes run with the site. What it really means is if you're looking on acquiring a site, you need to pay attention to what the timeframes are. You might be able to go in and do a bona fide prospective purchaser, ACO, and get them adjusted up front. But if you aren't in that position and you buy a site, the clock's ticking already, and you need to be mindful of it. And the LSRPs, of course, have the obligation to notify people, the department and their PRCR, if a deadline is going to be missed. Interesting thing might be if the prior LSRP at a site didn't do that, and now all of a sudden someone comes in and they're in the soup a little bit because the deadline's about to be missed. There might be some action against that prior LSRP, which seems to be a lot of what the board is doing these days. So that's it.
Yeah, I mean, well, just a comment about it. I mean, the idea that the timeframes run with the site seems sort of set up to create problems down the road. And I know that's not the department's intent. The department's intent is to make sure that these sites get moved along. But where you have, you know, kind of a new party to a site, you know, who's not responsible, you know, it's not clear to me that we really need a, you know, an ACO or an adjusted ACO in order to kind of move forward where historically timeframes were missed. But, you know, there we have it.
Yeah, here I have a comment on that. First of all, if in fact you're bumping up against a time frame, and let's say it's a mandatory time frame, and let's say that the purchaser wants to take the SIP the project, but he or she's concerned about this mandatory time frame. Maybe it's only like half a year. Maybe I have 6 months to fix this thing, and taking a look at the reports, and it barely started. The department should be delighted, absolutely delighted, that a new party's coming in to really get serious about cleaning up that site. And you can request an extension. I think you have to do it 90 days before the mandatory time frame hits the clock. But you can come in and make a compelling argument that this is what I'm going to do. This is what should have been done. This is what's been done, and this what needs to be done. And this is what we're going to do. And here's the time frame that we're going to do it. We shouldn't be penalized for the inaction of another party. Let us go forward, clean the slate, and let us do what you want us to do and clean that site up and develop it. I think you can make a compelling argument for that.
I think you're right. I think the question is whether or not it requires you to enter into an ACO or some kind of adjusted ACO. But in any event, move on to the next one.
Let's rock. We got about 10 minutes by my clock,
I
but
think
we'll
we can
see
do
how
it.
we do. Yep,
So
let's go.
the change to the rule here about immediate environmental concerns is itself kind of narrow, but it derives from a concern about how IECs, how vapor intrusion was being addressed under certain circumstances where the party who was doing the remediation might argue or say or determine that a structure, a building structure, was unoccupied, right? If a building wasn't occupied, by the public or by a person, then, there had been cases made that vapor intrusion did not need to be addressed in these spaces. And there weren't a whole lot of specific requirements about how that should be dealt with. And I know in some of my own sites, there were, portions of buildings or structures, basements, etc., that might be unoccupied that, might otherwise have to be subject to vapor intrusion mitigation, further investigation, etc. And there was some concern about how that was being controlled, how those were being addressed, and trying to put some limits on when a party could say, or an LSRP might determine the structure's unoccupied, I don't need to address vapor intrusion. And so the changes to the rule here were that it's made clear that you need to consider vapor intrusion in an unoccupied structure or building, except in a very narrow set of circumstances. So it sort of wipes away the
I've been on terminal.
Hey, Roger, go on mute again. I hope all is well. In any event, so they really sort of did away with the ability to say a structure's not occupied and I don't need to consider vapor intrusion, except where A, the building's not occupied, B, it won't be occupied, 3, the building will be demolished, and D, just to mix it all up, you get a certification from the property owner that these facts are true. And so it really sort of ratchets down when you could, kind of take that kind of exception.
Right.
And I will say there's still some, what does it mean the building will be demolished? When? Someday it will. But in any event, that's what this item is all about.
But Steve, but it's important to realize, and correct me if I'm wrong, that no remedial action has to be taken place on that building.
In that situation.
Right.
Yes, correct. That it is, sort of regulatory relief in that narrow set of circumstances. I would say it also sort of eliminates the relief in many other circumstances. But it's a reasonable thing to ask a party to consider, is there an immediate environmental concern in a structure if a person were going to go into it, and if it's not well controlled or it's not controlled by the property owner with the anticipation that it's going to be demolished, then it may be difficult to control that situation. So it certainly has a public health purpose in mind, and a good one.
Right, but those are kind of limited because a person, generally speaking, has to be occupied unless there's a significant risk of explosion or super toxic materials. Other than that, not so much.
Well, it's a pretty narrow rule proposal that we're talking about here. Yes. Should we move on to the last one?
Let's move on to the last one. You're up, Dennis.
Right on time.
I
Wow.
don't, wow. So the last one is kind of an interesting one. It's not quite clear what the department's trying to accomplish by it. It's not one where there's a lot of discussion, but they're proposing a rule change to specifically say that PRCRs are subject to the rules of the Licensed Site Remediation Professional Board. So the board is intended to regulate LSRPs, not PRCRs. So what does it mean when now the PRCRs are going to be subject to the board rules? Do some of the requirements of the LSRPs now apply to PRCRs? It's really creates a bit of a head scratcher and a concern that might be an unintended consequence of the change, because there's not a lot of discussion about it. I know it's been raised as a concern among the PRCR community, in particular, as to why are we now going to be subject to the regulations of an agency that was created to regulate LSRPs, not PRCRs. And I don't know if the board was advised that this was coming, Phil, but it is a bit of a head scratcher. And I think it's something where certainly in the comment and response process, hopefully there'll be some clarification as to what the department's trying to do with it, or they'll just take it out.
Yeah, I mean, speaking on behalf of Phil Brilliant, I would say that I don't remember this conversation in the SRRA 2.0 discussions. I will tell you, I don't remember the conversation in the board rules discussions. So I am not quite sure where this came from. I do know in the board discussions, and there were some changes to the board rules when they came out, relative to rules that LSRPs are obligated to. Because originally, actually, the board rules were not one of the lists of rules LSRPs were obligated to. That was corrected in the quote unquote SRRA 2.0 update. But when I read this, I've asked the question. I don't really know what the answer is as of yet. But I don't remember this being discussed. So I will say that.
And I don't know if I'm not sure you said this, but I think you implied it, Dennis. If not, I'll say it, because I've had some fun talking with our lawyer friends, those of us who like to get together and talk about site remediation, DEP rules. And
It is always an exciting conversation, Steve.
it is. It's a blast. So there's a couple who shall remain nameless who like to talk about whether the department is really authorized to propose this rule or to adopt this rule. I mean, does the board have jurisdiction over these folks? Are the board rules, should the Site Remediation Reform Act be interpreted that the board rules apply only to LSRPs and not to others? So I think there is room to kind of kick this around. Next time we're at a bar association function, Dennis, I'll grab maybe Andy Robbins, and we can have some fun on this one. I will note that the statute, right, 58:10C says the board can take enforcement action against any person.
Any person.
Yeah,
And
but it's a question of what does that mean? And clearly the board could take action against someone who is acting as an LSRP without a license, right? That's
Sure.
different than saying every PRCR is subject to the board rules. So, and I think those on the call who aren't members of the bar just got a hint about how exciting bar association meetings usually are.
Not enough alcohol at those.
I was gonna say, I hope there's a lot of alcohol.
Sometimes it's the only way to get through them, Phil.
Yeah.
So if that's, are we completely done on the formal program? Is that
We
my
went
understanding?
through the list, and I think
Yeah.
that was very good. So why don't you have some closing remarks
Well,
and shots?
I want to go back real quickly to fill use plans. And the point is, don't be ashamed of implementing a random check of the fill that's coming into your site. Have them dump it. They're not going to like it. Your client's not going to like it, particularly when he's facing some very significant time. This particular project was involved in the development of a site in Bayonne for the largest movie studio in the East Coast. and they were moving post haste, and that's why I got fired, to be perfectly honest with you. So don't be ashamed of doing what's right. Just do it. I want to thank our panelists. Just incredible, good stuff. We, you will get bills from both Phil. I'm sorry, not from Phil, from Steve and Dennis, because that legal advice doesn't come cheap. On the other hand, Phil and I are just blowing in the wind. You can do whatever you want with our advice.
So our legal advice is worth every penny people paid for it. And I just want to know that there is no truth to the rumor that there are signs up at the toll booths on the Goethals and the Outer Bridge Crossing saying, if you see this band coming to Staten Island, call the police immediately.
Well, one of the things I did, and that's just anecdotally, I shut down the New Jersey Turnpike. It was free admission or free tolls because we had an episode with toxic waste. And I became a hero for 2 seconds. Okay, so but again, thank you so much.
Well, before we close, let's do a couple things. So I think the comment period has been extended. I think we're going to be January 15th,
26.
somewhere around there.
Yeah,
In that ballpark. I probably should know the answer. I know that there are many organizations putting together comments. There are individuals putting together comments. Thank you, Mark. January 31st is the extended date. In a perfect world, they have a year, right, to come back and respond and promulgate. So we're looking at, January of 2026 that we would see implementations of these rules.
Yeah.
Would that be correct, Steve and Dennis?
If they take the whole time to adopt them, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And don't forget that the gift we got from the department last January 2nd, that year is just about up.
Right.
So we're going to have new remediation standards to deal with soon. And anybody who has magic powder to get rid of vinyl chloride, you could be very wealthy. Hey, Rick.
Yeah.
Hey, George, can I just jump in with one thing, though?
Absolutely.
To remind people that the statute still is in effect.
Right.
Even though the rule might not be adopted till January 2026,
Right.
you obviously got to follow whatever's in the statute.
Right. And not only that, you can't avoid a policy, an existing policy and programs that are already in effect at DEP. And a lot of this is really stuff that's going to be codified that's already in the process. You can't ignore it. You can't wait for the rule to be approved in order to qualify to conform with what's already in place.
And one good example of that is the endangered species part, where the department notes that people are expected to be complying with those laws already.
Yeah. The only exception to that is, quite frankly, is a lot of the vapor issues, which are not in place.
And can I ask another question there? Because since Dennis brought it up that we're going to have the groundwater quality standards, which will change the remediation standards, has there been any confirmation on the phase-in period for that rule in the remediation program, since it's not necessarily a remediation program rule that comes with phase-in periods of usually 6 months? I know we've asked for a confirmation. I've not seen anything. Have you heard anything?
I've not seen anything.
Neither have I.
Okay.
Don't look
So
at
no
the-
legal opinions either, right?
Not from
It's a
us.
very important topic. No, very important.
Steve, you have an answer to the question?
I had a question, not an answer. And I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand, so I figured I just
Suppose you just go like this and your hand goes up. My hand keeps going up. So
follow up to what was just said about, being mindful that you have to follow what was implemented under SRRA. Interested, Steve and Dennis, if you think, and I hope I know the answer, but do you think that with respect to the discharge notification requirement, if that has been implemented through the statutory process?
You're talking about the one in the rule proposal?
Yes.
I don't think it's part of the statute at all. I think it's contrary to the statute.
I agree 100%. So I'm glad that's the answer.
It makes 3 here. And I see Ray Papperman and a few of our friends, Rick Engel, but no, I agree with Dennis.
Thanks.
Steve, you were in the room with us when we talked about
Yeah,
it.
four
Yeah.
for sure.
Four.
Yeah,
Hey, Ray.
nowhere does it say any person who has knowledge of the discharge. Nowhere does it say that.
But of course, if we all wanted to have fun, we'd start calling the hotline every day now.
That's not my kind of fun.
Yeah.
Can't afford
Yeah.
the bill.
We'll see you at the next bar association meeting, Steve.
Very good.
So listen,
Raise buying.
so listen, let me just
Hey,
say,
my programs are always fun.
all right. Yeah, only when you're in New Orleans. He went to Tulane, but don't hold it against him. Thank you so much for everybody who participated in this and who attended this. I am wowed by the number of people who came into this particular discussion. And I really appreciate it. It's rewarding, makes us feel like we're doing something meaningful. And I thank you for participating. And I really thank our panel. I can't thank you enough. Phil, it's all yours.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, Dennis, and George, for all your hard work on this. It was a lot of work to put it together, and wish everybody a happy, healthy holiday and New Year. And 2025 is shaping up to be an interesting year.
I have one last question. Is there any truth to the rumor that Phil Brilliant has applied to be the next president of Rutgers?
I'm turning back my diploma now.
Just as much as Tom's River doesn't want me, Rutgers definitely doesn't want me.
Right.
You know,
Steve and I are going to pick it.
See how that list goes. So everyone take care of yourselves. Have a great day, safe and be well. Thanks again.
Happy
guys.
holidays,
Thanks.
everybody.
Happy